agenda items that we'll be covering will be middleware implementations. We're going to get into some real specifics on this and really detail that out. And finally, evaluation processes of the implementation process. The middleware implementation is really about the implementation, as we've gone through in previous sessions, is really that middle layer of components. Okay. However, the modularity of those components brings in a certain level of complexity that creates a rather daunting challenge for some organizations. Because of the design of that and those limitations, we really have to look at our implementation plan and methodology as we kind of approach this, and then finally making sure that our evaluation process is accurate with how we're going to be implementing it. So really, regardless of the organizational size or need, there's going to be consistencies throughout the implementation process with consideration to middleware. For example, if we have a large-scale implementation, we're going to be having more analysis up front, obviously, than we would with a smaller organization, and their business needs or their business units may be less sophisticated or less robust. The security may be a little different. Performance issues are going to be different. So those are the types of things that we'll have to look for in the implementation process of middleware. Just some general things that we want to take a look at in terms of implementations is, and I kind of got into this just a couple minutes ago, is size of organization, what kind of applications are going to be deployed in that middle tier. So I just want to diagram real quickly. I just want to break this out because we have components that exist here and we have components that exist here. So I just want to kind of focus on this area here of middleware. So I'm just going to bring this up here. So this is middleware. Okay, that's our middle tier environment. Okay, and then we have our web server, and then we have our application server. Okay. And we could have other servers existing in here other than the application server. So we could have other report servers running. Okay, or we could have some business-specific server running, providing us some business logic or business objects or business reporting that's unlike your primary reporting server. So if this is kind of what we're looking at in terms of implementation, what would we need to do in order to achieve an outcome of scalability, robustness, and security? Okay, so really the methodology itself and the implementer who's going to be doing that would have to take a look at a couple of different things. One, we'll have an analysis phase to make sure that ultimately what's happening here and what's happening here at the database level and at the client level, because there are components here and here, are being met. So even though we isolate on the middle tier itself, we can't lose sight of what's happening from that client perspective. He's got his little hat on there. And at the database layer, right? Because this is where the data lives. So this could be a new environment as well, coming from a legacy system into this. This could be brand new. You can go from having no middle layer or middleware to an environment that they have to build this out. Or they could have existing components in their middle layer and we're just adding something new. For example, this can be broken down. I'm just going to build this out a little bit more. So this could actually be Oracle running here and Microsoft IIS running here. Or this could be Apache running here, and we could have WebSphere here. So depending on what the overall configurations are or the requirements are, we could build in the components as needed. And we could even build out, without even going through any one vendor, we could have a completely open source environment with Apache and Tomcat running free of charge. So we can run these open source environments, download all the components off the web, eliminate these three, eliminate anything down here, and have a very robust, scalable, and secure environment. So part of the implementation is making sure that the analysis is done to determine what's appropriate for that middleware layer of components. Okay. Really, I should probably start to think about this part here. So we have analysis, right? And that's going to go into really our approach to I'm going to break this out a little different. To development. So we have a number of different boxes that we'll have to go through. So first we analyze to make sure we got. Then if we have any specific applications that we're going to build out and put into here, which reside in here, then that would happen at the development level. And then ultimately, we'd have deployment, which would happen here. So, and it's a very simplistic mechanism or simplistic view of it. We'd have analysis, and then from analysis, we determine what's needed. We'd go into development, and ultimately go into deployment. And the deployment is always an evaluation process as well, to make sure that we're meeting the objectives of getting the systems in. Some organizations, typically large organizations, have a very clear standard operating procedure of how their deployment must work. The deployment must be, for example, a single file here that deploys the entire application. For example, a single WAR file for deployment. A WAR file is just a zipped file of all needed application components, not just specific pages. That could be like a JSP page or a single jar file, which is really smaller. The WAR file can be deployed here at the application server level, and it builds out the complete application. So again, that's part of the analysis phase. The analysis would determine that that's part of an SOP or standard operating procedure to bring in that application. The development happens to make sure that that application has all the appropriate logic, security built into it. Then the deployment would be here. So just making sure that the implementation process, and I used an open source as an example, but if we just go back through Oracle's, if we hit specifically on Oracle, and their view of it is slightly different. Oracle's implementation is web server / app server combination. So it's an integrated package, along with all your needed wireless components, portals, any business-specific requirements, business intelligence there. So all that's bundled in here. So again, analysis determining what kind of application server components are required, any development that's needed to making sure that we can get your appropriate applications in here. If you're running Oracle, you could run Oracle Forms through Oracle Forms Server, which is a separate component here. This is for Forms. You could have a separate one for Reports Server. So again, the analysis phase would determine what we need here, and making sure the development of those forms is appropriate and the mechanisms for which they get into the system. Then, once that happens and we have the appropriate environment there, we can just easily deploy that into the system and making sure that it's bringing back the correct data. Now, the evaluation process is really determining and making sure that this is validated properly. So the validation cycles is our final step. Validation. And of course, validation is making sure that if we have forms or reports, it's going back to the database, it's retrieving the data correctly, and it's really providing the end user with the information that is appropriate and accurate, ultimately. So really, middleware implementations, like I said, regardless of the client, does have some common elements to it. However, once you get beyond those common elements, there is some very unique situations that we must look at. And one of them is obviously the provider that we want to look at, the vendor. The vendor will, in many ways, dictate what that implementation plan is. Oracle has got a very specific implementation plan when it does some type of middleware or back-end deployments. And that can really be done, or we can look at that through the evaluation process. So we looked at Oracle, we looked at an open source view of it as well. And again, that open source environment can be one system or it could be multiple systems. So we have a number of different configurations that we can have in implementation of middleware. But we can't really lose sight of two things. One, the user, because really that's the single, to me, one of the single most important elements is getting the data that they need, or getting all those data elements back to them, because ultimately they're the ones that drive that process. And two is determining that we have connectivity and access into that database environment. And we do that through analysis, we do that through development, we do that through deployment, and really we do that through the validation cycles and making sure that that information is correct. Okay, so we looked at implementations, we looked at a couple different mechanisms we can use. We looked at a couple of different vendors, a couple of different configurations. We also looked at the evaluation process to make sure that we're achieving our ultimate goals. And how those two play together and making sure that we have the correct implementation strategy or plan.